Well, thanks everyone. And when we started organizing, I said, big hall, big hall. I know our community is very concerned about this, but I want to say that even though as the public safety critic, I got the privilege of playing a lead role on this, it's teamwork in our caucus. And I want to point those of you who are real geeks to Murray's speech in the House of Commons. You can find that. You should read his speech. I know some excerpts were in the Times column. It's a really fine speech at second reading against this bill. I have 3 pages of notes here, and I'll tell you why. That's to cut it down. I've already spoken in the House of Commons for over 7 hours this week on this bill, and the Conservatives got so tired of it, one of them actually resorted to sticking his tongue out at me. Very dignified debate. As one Twitter wag said, this Conservative government has a knack for introducing legislation that inspires hundreds of law professors to sign open letters. And we're fortunate to have one of the signatories of that open letter with us who will be introduced later on. But I'd have to say this time they've outdone themselves. Now we have an open letter signed by 4 former prime ministers, 5 former Supreme Court justices, 3 former ministers of justice, 4 former public safety ministers, and 3 former members of the Security Intelligence Review Committee, which is the CSIS review agency that the government likes to call robust. Okay? That's a pretty impressive list of people from all parties, who have said this bill is a danger to the fight against terrorism and to our civil liberties both. And I think that should cause the government to step back. Now, I want to say a little about process. I'm probably way more fascinated by parliamentary process than anyone else in the room. But I want to talk about the first thing we did, which was called a reasoned amendment. And I got some questions about this from people. So why did we move an amendment? At second reading, which is the vote in principle in Parliament, there's only one thing the opposition can do, and that's to move an amendment which lays out the reasons for not proceeding. So it's not an attempt to amend the bill. It's called a reasoned amendment. It simply says this should go no farther for the following reasons. And so I had the privilege of moving that motion for the opposition. I believe the text of it's in the back. It's certainly online if anyone wants to have a close look. But let me just lay it out very quickly. The bill is overly broad, so it covers way too much in the bill. It's dangerously vague. It invents all kinds of new terms that don't exist in law and has no definitions for them. It will probably be ineffective against terrorism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's a major threat to our civil liberties. And finally, it has nothing at all in it to provide more oversight. So we've argued that if you're going to increase the powers of your security agencies, you have to have a corresponding increase in the ability of civilian authorities to oversee what they're doing, especially CSIS, which operates in secret. And the last thing it said was it has nothing to bring forward programs to counter radicalization of youth, which is the single most effective thing we can do to combat terrorism. Not a word in the bill, despite the fact that we've repeatedly heard ministers saying the bill covers that. And accuse us of not reading the bill. I would say that's a little bit of projection on their part. I've read the bill several times. So I want to make it clear to everybody that I personally and the NDP believes the threat is real. There is a real terrorism threat. But what has to happen is that we have to do things that meet the real threats and do so effectively. And so casting a really huge net, which draws in thousands and thousands of people, I like to use the analogy. The police and CSIS say looking for terrorists is like looking for a needle in the haystack. And the last thing they need is more hay. And so when you start spreading the net very broadly and collecting all this information without expanding your resources, you are bound to miss the real threats. And so not only does it threaten our civil liberties, it threatens the war or the struggle against terrorism. And this is a government, of course, that says it's very serious about this. They're so serious they cut the budget of the RCMP every year since 2012. They've cut the budget of CSIS every year since 2012. And CIRC, Security Intelligence Review Committee, which reviews CSIS, has the same budget it did 10 years ago. But this year they put in an increase. And the estimates just came down, and the increase is $10,000. That's simply so they can spin it that they've increased the budget. Right? That's what you'll hear them saying. Increase the budget for CIRC. I've already heard it 3 times in Parliament. So we went and looked, $10,000. So the reason amendment was voted on, as was C-51 at second reading. So that's the vote in principle. New Democrats, of course, voted against it. I will give a shout out to the Green Party, who also voted against it. The Liberals and the Conservatives both supported the bill. I will also say the Public Safety Committee, Elizabeth May has asked to be able to take a seat at the committee during the hearings on this, and the NDP is supporting that request, although we doubt that it will be allowed. Now let me talk a little bit about the filibuster. Filibuster is a word that means delay, really. Talking to delay. We were not trying to delay the bill. What we were doing was debating the organization of the public hearings, the number of people and when we would hear from them. And so it's a quirk in the House of Commons rules that that's one thing that you can't have closure of the debate on. You can talk as long as you like about how many witnesses and when, because normally there's not much to say about that. And so we found, on the first day in camera, we found 7 hours of things to say about that. And the Conservatives got more and more irritated. Their original offer, I'll be very frank with you, that was in camera. It's since been leaked, so everyone knows. It was 3 meetings, and to allow the official opposition to call 6 witnesses on this bill, 6. So we just simply said we're going to be here a very long time. And we said, we'll meet your deadlines. If you say it's necessary to finish these by Easter, we'll meet that. And as Murray already said, we went out in public and said we'll meet in the evenings, we'll meet on weekends, we'll meet during the constituency break weeks, because we think the most important thing is to have full and complete airing of what's in this bill so the public knows what the government is doing. And the Conservatives said no. So once the debate broke out in public, and I'm not allowed to talk about how that happened, but the committee meetings started taking place in public, the Conservatives then found themselves in a bit of a pickle. If they didn't offer more, they were going to look really bad. So we were calling for 25 meetings. Now, why did we pick a number like that? Because that would allow for between 80 and 100 witnesses total, and our share of that would have been around 40 witnesses. And we already had 60 requests from groups and individuals with expertise on this bill who wanted to appear. It's not an unreasonable amount. When the first anti-terrorism bill was adopted in 2001, they heard 80 witnesses over 19 meetings. So not an unreasonable request at all. The Conservatives got so frustrated on Thursday, they simply adopted bully tactics. They ignored the rules, written rules of the House of Commons that say you can't call the question on this. The chair, who's a very honorable Conservative, ruled against them. They challenged the chair, overruled the chair, broke the rules of the House of Commons, and went ahead and said we're going to have the 8 days of hearings, which results in about 14 witnesses for us. So a small victory, I would say, for the public, in that we'll hear a few more voices. And we've appealed to the Speaker today to say, how can a committee ignore the written rules of the House of Commons? It's the bully tactics and the lack of respect for parliamentary democracy in its most extreme form that we've seen in this Parliament. The rules don't matter. We won. We have a majority. We'll do what we like. And the part that I think didn't hit the public was that then we were given 3 hours to submit our witnesses. Having not known how many we'd have, now we expected they might do this. We were relatively ready. But 3 hours. So on Thursday afternoon, you had to contact people, see if they're willing to appear, have their contact information, and have it all submitted by 6 p.m. Right? That's the kind of government this is, a bullying government. So we've done that, and we'll see how successful we are in getting people before the committee. Now, I'm already going on too long. Let me talk about just some what's in the bill. Murray said I'll do it quickly. That's absolutely impossible. But there are some themes. The first theme that I talked about before is this bill is vague and has poorly defined concept throughout the bill. That should worry you. This is law we're talking about. Now, when the Minister of Justice was asked about the definition of terrorism, he said, we're not going to get bogged down in details.
Go look it up.
Go look it up, he said. Not ignoring the fact that this bill, of course, changes that for many things, but not for the criminal act of terrorism, but for almost everything else. So there's a new offense, and I'm sorry I'm being ironic tonight, but the new offense is a criminal offense to promote terrorism, and here's the legal term, in general. It actually says in general. what legal meaning could that possibly have? And the other problem with that, of course, is it's already illegal to promote specific acts of terrorism. So we've been asking the government to say, why this new offense? What is this? What does it do? A second example is that it now, in the bill, the government likes to talk about terrorism in public. In the bill, it talks about the security of Canada. So it shifts very subtly from terrorism, which everybody's against, and everybody can understand why you may need to do some things, to security of Canada, which includes infrastructure like pipelines, which includes financial and economic security, which includes a whole raft of things that are now laid out, that are now subject to surveillance, right, and possibly subject to detention. So a very serious concern throughout the bill is this very vague, very general kinds of things that are there. A second concern that runs through the bill is that it lowers the threshold for the government to act against citizens. So we've had fairly high standards for saying the government can't act against you unless it actually has things like evidence, right? And one of the lawyers I was talking about said, for some of these things, we have a standard of evidence that is about as low as you can imagine, and the government just lowered that. So I know some others will talk about this, but one of the things that's very worrying is it moves the definition for action from reasonable to believe something will take place to suspect that it might happen. Okay? You should all be very worried about that, right? To suspect that it might happen is not a standard for which you can present evidence, right? Reasonable to believe it will happen, okay, law enforcement, CSIS can present evidence on that. Suspect it might happen, there's no evidentiary standard that you can use. And so the courts will be quite challenged, or on the other hand, with this government's record, the government will be quite challenged to have this bill stand up in court. So 3 things missing. I've already said no oversight, but I think I need to stop for a minute because the government always says, CSIS has oversight. They do not. They have review. And it seems like a technicality, but here's a very important difference. Oversight is someone who in real time supervises what CSIS is doing because they do it in secret. And there was such a person called the Inspector General of CSIS until 2012. And that person reported to the minister and the director of CSIS, had access to all their files, all their documents, and was responsibility was to say, CSIS agents are obeying the law. The Conservatives eliminated that position. It's gone. There is no such position. And they say, well, CERC will take care of that, except that CERC has no capacity or ability to do real-time oversight, which is very important because it's secret things that are being done. A third thing, I guess, a second thing that's missing, as I said, there's nothing to counter radicalization of youth. The government has some stale plans on its drawing board that remain unfunded and unimplemented, and so it says we have a plan. Yes, it's 3 years old, you've not done anything with it and has no money. So it's a great plan, right? Nothing to do with what's actually going on, and the communities, in particular the Muslim community in this country, is way ahead of the government in trying to put together concrete measures to help counter radicalization. And we need to work with the Muslim community in this country to make sure that that's a success. So I'm going to conclude by saying the third thing that's not there is this thing called evidence. And so Murray made reference to the shooting in Parliament Hill. In October, there was the incident in Saint-Jean-Richelieu in which 2 members together of the Canadian Forces lost their lives. We have no reports on those incidents. No completed investigations reports. Yet this bill, the government says, responds to those threats. I don't know how they know that. And the Prime Minister was asked in his campaign-style rally, how do you know that this would have prevented those? And he said, oh, we can't be sure about that. So we're passing an anti-terrorism bill based on the supposition that it might meet the threats that are out there without the government presenting evidence that that is true. And the last one, again, one of my ironic favorites, at his press conference, the Prime Minister was asked, was this bill directed at 13-year-olds in the basement who hadn't learned proper boundaries of use of the internet? And he said yes. Right? He said yes. So again, it comes back to resources. We have limited resources to devote to the real threats to our society, and we should not waste them on 13-year-olds in the basement, when in fact what we should be doing is having the programs that counter radicalization that those 13-year-olds might run into. And so that's my sort of summary of the bill. It's not a legal summary. It's the kind of thematic reasons that many, many parts of this bill are seriously flawed. And I know we have two panels, so we'll talk a bit more about this. So again, I'm so encouraged to see so many people out. We have to raise our voices. I'm not an optimist on this one, I have to say, but I wasn't an optimist on the Unfair Voting Act, and we did get some significant changes in that through public opinion forcing the government. And I'll have to say, when our public safety meeting went public, when it went on the air live, we received more than 200 calls in the first 2 hours in my office in Ottawa saying, keep going, we care about this. Because the conservatives were saying, you're just going on, and nobody in the public really cares about this, right? They just want us to do something about terrorism. And so, again, I'm very encouraged. And after this meeting, if you feel inspired, you have to let the government know that you are listening and you do know what they're up to in this one. Thanks very much.
You know, the first question that I'm sure is on your mind is just the simplest one. Will this bill do what it sets out to do? Will it address the real threats of terrorism? Will it make us safer? Well, I'm so pleased to have as our Reg Whitaker with us. Professor Whitaker may be known to you. He's a national expert on this topic of national security. Emeritus Professor of York University, Adjunct Professor at the University of Victoria, co-author of a book entitled Secret Service, the first comprehensive history of political policing in Canada. Reg was an advisor to the O'Connor Commission on Mayor Arar, the inquiry into Mayor Arar, and he's advised the Commission of Inquiry into the Air India bombing issue. He is really an expert, and we're so grateful he lives right here in Victoria and came to give us a hand explaining it. Thanks so much, Reg.
Good evening. It's really nice to see all these people out here. When the government brought in Bill C-51, they were really saying, and in as many words they were saying, if we're going to give you more security, you're going to have to give up some of your liberties. That balance has to be changed. Now, when a government comes to you and says that they want extraordinary powers, that they want to sort of, redraw the line between the state and society, I think there's a number of questions that parliamentarians and the public should address to a government that's asking, making that kind of a request. The first question is, has the problem that you're seeking to solve been clearly defined? And the answer to that is no, it certainly has not. The Prime Minister kicked it all off, not before Parliament, not before the Canadian people, but at a Conservative Party rally, and he said, a great evil has been descending upon our world. Yeah. Yeah. And now, the problem, now they say it's terrorism. Terrorism is the greatest threat we've ever faced. I thought we had a lot of other, threats like global, warming and so on, but no, terrorism. But when you look at the definitions of terrorism, and Randall's already spoken to this in the bill, they are not only overbroad, as lawyers like to say, they're vastly overbroad. They've extended way beyond terrorism to include almost anything that interferes, for example, with the economic or financial stability of Canada, that might affect their critical infrastructures, et cetera, and even when they're talking about terrorism, and again, Randall spoke about this, they talk about terrorism in general. This is, it's just to cover everything. It's kind of drift net fishing out there. And so this is a serious problem. The second question is to ask the government that's asking for these new powers, have you used the existing powers that you have? And the answer to that is no. Now, in 2001, after 9/11, the Liberal government at the time passed the first Anti-Terrorism Act, and they introduced two extraordinary new powers: preventive detention and investigative hearings. And they were so controversial that, in fact, they put sunset clauses on them. And it's about 15 years now. You know how many times they've used preventive detention and investigative hearings? Never. Not once. Not once. Now they want to extend the period for preventive detention for all the people that they haven't detained. That's one. Now they talk about new offenses for promoting and advocating terrorism. We already have on the criminal code incitement to violence as a criminal offense. We have hate speech laws, and they could be used and have not been used effectively at all. The third question is, are the new powers proportionate to the threat? And here the answer is clearly no. They are wildly disproportionate to the threat. Now I'll just quickly try to run over a few things, and these start out as sort of reasonably good ideas, we just sort of say them in general. For one thing, better information sharing. We know that before 9/11 happened in the U.S. that it could have been prevented if the CIA had talked to the FBI and if parts of the FBI had talked to other parts of the FBI and so on, but they didn't, and so key information was lost. Okay, let's have better information sharing to combat terrorism. But what they've done is that they've opened it up in a way that destroys the basic privacy protections. Good reasons why your data that is picked up by one government department isn't allowed to talk to the database that another government department has on you, because in fact you don't want a 1984 society in which government knows everything about you. They've knocked down those barriers, and supposedly just for terrorism, but who knows what that could be used for. Stopping promotion of jihad on the internet. Okay, that's got to be, everybody agree with that. You don't want to have that sort of thing going on. It's so broadly drawn, however, that it imperils the right of freedom of expression much more generally. The no-fly list, they said they were improving the no-fly list. What they've done, actually, and I could go on at this at some length, but I won't. I'll just say this, that what they've done is that they have now created a no-fly list that will look like the discredited American no-fly list, that we put ours into place in order to prevent the Americans imposing theirs on us. Now, the no-fly list in the U.S. that says that, a 2-year-old toddler wasn't allowed to get on a plane. They said your mother can go on the plane, but the 2-year-old's got a name of a terrorist, so couldn't go on. That's what they're going to give us. But the worst thing of all, in my view, in this bill, is the CSIS disruption warrants, which they are now saying that CSIS, not the RCMP, but CSIS should be able to disrupt terrorist plots. Well, the RCMP is already doing that. They're doing it very effectively. They did it with the Toronto 18, and they in undercover sources that provided sort of ineffective explosive materials. They did it with a pair that are now on trial here for trying to put a bomb at the legislature in Canada today. And again, they disrupted it. But the RCMP does this with a view to law enforcement, because they're a law enforcement agency. And they're looking down the road to bringing things to trial. CSIS is not a law enforcement agency. And this is very, very dangerous. But when you read what's actually in this, it is quite unbelievable. It is truly unbelievable. What they're saying is that they will go in secret to a judge, present the case in secret to a judge, no contrary opinions being offered. And if the judge agrees to provide them with this disruption warrant, they can do basically anything they want. Well, not anything. They're not allowed to torture, murder, rape. Well, I tell you, read the bill. That's what it says. But short of that, they can break the law, they can violate charter rights, and they already have a get-out-of-jail-free card from a judge to do this with impunity and in secret. And we won't even know, and the people who are the targets of this won't even know, because You know, there's absolutely nothing, no way of finding out what that is. This is so wrong in every sense of the word, but just let me add one thing here. This is to make judges who are supposed to be the arbiters of the constitutionality and legality of government action, who review what government does and says, is this appropriate, is it not appropriate? And they would be drafted into being enablers of law-breaking. I don't think judges are going to like this very much, but you know, that's what's written into the statute. The next, the fourth question that has to be addressed is, are there adequate safeguards in place to protect against abuse of these new powers, or potential abuse? Well, even the use of these new powers is pretty abusive in itself. Anyway, the answer to that is no. That what we see is the rapid acceleration of government security powers, not matched by any kind of oversight, review, and indeed by a marked deterioration of the capacity, even for the limited review that we've already had in place over the last 15 years. That the accountability mechanisms are simply not adequate to the job. They can't follow the trails of investigation from their stovepipe to CSIS as CERC, and many of them don't have any oversight at all. And it's completely and utterly inadequate and getting worse. Okay, the last question, and this is the one that I think is really important because, you know, the government has been saying to the NDP, you know, you're against, you know, they say, you know, you voted against every new national security power there is. Said Tom Mulcair is trying to prevent the police and security from agencies from protecting Canadians against terrorism. Yeah, and extremists, yeah, right. But the last question is, will these new measures actually increase security? Will they be effective against terrorism? And I think the answer to that is very clearly no. Return to the disruption warrants that I was just talking about a moment ago. What we're looking at here is, if these things go through and if these things are actually granted and go into operation, we're going to see a revival of the old RCMP CSIS turf wars. The ones that, for example, over Air India, why was Air India allowed to happen? That was the worst intelligence failure and the worst security disaster in Canadian history. 329 people lost their lives. And why was that allowed to happen? And why were those responsible never brought to justice? Never. The end. And that one of the reasons is that there were these turf wars between the RCMP and CSIS. We're back to it. CSIS is going to be trampling on the jurisdiction of the RCMP. And worse than that is that CSIS is an intelligence agency. It's not a law enforcement agency. And the RCMP is always interested in bringing these cases to trial. And now we're going to have CSIS running around doing these things. They're not interested in going to trial. They're interested in gathering intelligence. But what they do in the course of this could contaminate the evidence, break evidentiary trails. Lawyers are horrified at the possibilities. And so we'll probably have failed court cases as a result. Okay, there's the promotion and advocacy provisions, and I'll try to finish up here, in that we spoke about a moment ago, are counterproductive to the dialogue with the Muslim community. That if you're really talking about de-radicalization programs about youth, this is only creating suspicion and fear on the part of the Muslim community that anything they say could be used against them in any kind of a dialogue with government on these issues. the wildly overbroad definition of terrorism by extending potentially to environmentalists, First Nations, peaceful protesters, and so on, which is a very serious risk here in this legislation. And with this government that is labeled environmentalists as radicals, foreign financed, etc. At the end, if this is indeed the direction they're going, they're risking that CSIS, the RCMP, the enforcement agencies of security and policing are going to lose their social license, which is very important if they're actually going to have the Canadian public behind them in the fight against terrorism, which is a legitimate reason for their actions. But they're going to become extremely unpopular. Remember, there is some history here in the past. So I think it's a slam dunk all around that all 5 of the questions that I suggested should have been addressed all get the same answer. No, the government has failed.
The most common question that I hear is this bill going to chill free speech and threaten legitimate activism in Canada? In particular, we're concerned the Conservatives will apply these new powers to First Nations, environmental activists who stand in the way of projects like Enbridge Northern Gateway and Kinder Morgan. I know that concern is what's brought a lot of you here tonight as well. As I said in Parliament, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip was arrested on Burnaby Mountain over the Kinder Morgan issue, and what new threats to privacy and liberty would he have faced if this bill had been law then? Well, to talk about some of these questions, we have an amazing activist who's worked everywhere from the United Nations Refugee Program in Uganda to community organizations right here in Victoria. She's now an instructor in social justice at the University of Victoria and a researcher into nonviolence, social movements, and collective actions. Ladies and gentlemen, Laurel Collins.
Yeah, thank you. It's so great to see such a great turnout. And I do want to talk about this threat to dissent in Canada. And there's been a lot of conversation about the bill, and I'm just going to recap some of the things that are relevant to this topic in particular. And the first one is this expanded kind of spying powers of CSIS and the sharing that will happen. Next is this piece around disruption, and I'm going to come back to that. The next one is free speech, and then also these 9 descriptions of what undermines the security of Canada. And already mentioned in there was critical infrastructure and the kind of interference with the economic security of Canada, but also covert foreign operations or influences is in there as well. And when you link that to the same kind of discourse and language around foreign-funded radicals, we start to get this really scary picture of the direction that Canada is headed. So starting with that disruption piece, and so as Randall pointed out, it stops, and Reg as well, it stops at the kind of rape, torture, murder, things that it could actually include and things that other national security agencies do in terms of disruption techniques are breaking and entering, smear campaigns. It's also hacking into computers and deleting or swiping, like kind of deleting everything on them, draining bank accounts. So these are just some of the disruption techniques that are possible under this new bill. And then moving on to free speech. And so this bill actually introduces kind of a new speech crime, which is the advocating, kind of encouraging terrorism. And we do actually have speech crimes in Canada. The hate speech is a crime, but it's limited to public discourse. So this new kind of speech crime would be public and private, which becomes even more scary when you think about CSIS's new powers. And it's not only people who are intending to incite terrorism, it's also people who are, and this is the word from the bill, reckless in the outcome of their communications. And then when you think about that in connection with what they're considering to be undermining Canadian security, which includes people who are interfering with critical infrastructure and interfering with the financial stability of Canada, then you can see the kind of connections that we're making and the impacts for Indigenous communities, for the environmental movement as a whole. So yeah, I also want to talk about immediately after those kind of 9 things that constitute what undermines Canada's security. There's a little caveat that says that this doesn't include lawful protest, advocacy, dissent, and self-expression, or artistic, yeah, exactly, artistic expression. And so the key word in there is lawful, because what unlawful dissent includes are sit-ins, marches without permits. If you think of the civil rights movements and how many of these really important moments were unlawful acts of civil disobedience, and all of these unlawful acts of civil disobedience can now be kind of put under CSIS's new powers. Also wildcat strikes, so strikes that aren't according to traditional labor laws. So yeah, and then I want to add to that just the recently leaked RCMP documents and the kind of language that they're describing environmental activists and Indigenous activists. They're calling them violent Aboriginal extremists and anti-petroleum extremists, or anti-Canadian petroleum extremists, which it kind of boggles the mind. They're lumping in nonviolent civil disobedience and people who are engaged in this kind of peaceful protesting with what undermines the security of Canada. And it's kind of terrifying. And then I also wanted to bring out a couple things from those leaked RCMP documents. If you have a chance, I think it's just 12 pages, take a look at it. It's titled something along the lines of Threats to Critical Infrastructure in Canada. And for the first thing is they kind of call into question the legitimacy of climate change, which is scary that the RCMP documents are doing this. And they also focus on northern BC and New Brunswick. And so specifically Indigenous communities who are fighting against pipelines, who are fighting against fracking. And they label those as hotspots for this threat to Canadian security. And so that kind of ties in to this, how this bill is also undermining Section 35, the rights of Aboriginal peoples. And I'm not qualified to talk about it, but I think that this is also another missing piece in this conversation where we need to be thinking about how Aboriginal rights are undermined by this bill. Yeah, so all of those things, thank you. All of those things paint a really scary picture for dissent in Canada. And I'm really interested in kind of how social movements develop and evolve. Social movements aren't just these kind of strategic things that block certain policies or projects that we don't want to happen. They're also about forging collective identities. They're about building community. And these bills are threatening that. They're actually undermining, first of all, who wants to be involved in collective action, because all of a sudden you are potentially going to be spied upon, potentially going to be detained without charge. It makes it much more risky for people to join in these actions. Then, if you actually do decide to, and you're building community with people, and you're afraid that maybe your friend is a CSIS agent, or that CSIS is planting agent provocateurs in your movement, it undermines that community that we're building. And then for the people who are on the front lines, and these are mainly Indigenous communities and environmental activists who are there risking that, putting themselves in danger, they are then going to be criminalized with this bill. And I hate to paint this really scary, bleak picture, and so I want to end on a quote that is from Mahatma Gandhi, and he was engaged in so many unlawful acts of civil disobedience. The Salt March is kind of the one that sticks out the most. But he said, First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win.
The question is, are we following what Obama did with habeas corpus? Where if they take you away and you're detained and your family doesn't know where you are they going to allow you at least to have a lawyer and a phone call?
Good question.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually in the preventive detention power, that actually it does give you there is a lawyer, and it is circumscribed in time. I wouldn't get too worried about that one. As they say, they've never even used it anyway. So it doesn't seem like the most alarming power, and it is limited.
The question is, will the courts be backed into having no other alternative than to be charging people with criminal offenses?
There's a very good chance, and I think that she's right. Palmateer is right about the fact that there's going to be an intersection of the Aboriginal rights under Section 35 with the rights that are being abrogated in this bill. The problem, of course, is the judges are going to have to look at this with absolutely no evidence. You've heard Randall talk about the failure of evidence. A lot of the discussion is going to take place if we're targeting Aboriginal leaders without any lawyers for First Nations or others there. There's no special advocate. There's no lawyer, of course, by definition, there to look after the interests of anybody but the government, the CSIS. So it's hugely problematic. And I think another point is judges are going to be very resentful about the role we're asking them to play under this law.
What concerns me is how will the police be involved in this? The regular police and the RCMP, these people, how will Constable Plod be involved in packing? I don't think he's going to be able to disrupt our meetings and pretend to be a raging granny, but it must be a great problem for the police. Who else is going to this? They're not going to send somebody from CSIS over to.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. I think they are going to send somebody from CSIS. That's the point of the disruptive powers. So the disruptive powers are not about the actual criminal act of terrorism. They're about disrupting anything the government and CSIS perceives as a threat to the security of Canada. And so I know, being from Esquimalt, I've seen raging grannies doing lots of things in Esquimalt that the government might perceive to be a threat to the security of Canada. So under this bill, I'm not saying they'll have the resources, because I don't think they do, but they have the ability, and I'm going to differ with Reg. For most of the disruption, they do not have to go to a judge. Only if the disruption involves illegal activities do they have to get a warrant. So this authorizes them to do all kinds of things which aren't strictly illegal, but would be very disruptive to activists and their groups. They don't even have to go to a judge for that. And Murray makes the point, if they do go to a judge, there's nobody to represent the other side. It's a fundamental problem to asking for a warrant to disrupt your threats to Canada when you can't say, but I'm defending my rights if you're an Aboriginal person. You can't say, I have my right to free speech. You're not there when that warrant is authorized. And when CSIS goes away and carries out that activity, the difference from the police is the police do that in a criminal context where that warrant ends up back in court. And a judge says, what did you do with the warrant? Was that legal? How did you use the warrant? And if it wasn't, the prosecution fails. With CSIS, that warrant will never come back to court. The purpose of CSIS under this is to disrupt, not to bring criminal charges. So no judge will ever see what happens. And if you follow this carefully, you'll see that CSIS has a very poor record when it applies for warrants in being truthful. And this is the judge's words, that CSIS lacked candor in applying for warrants from judges. So it's a very, very serious problem. And I do believe it won't be the RCMP, that's the difference here. They're creating this secret disruptive power, which is extremely dangerous and a fundamental departure from Canadian values.
And the other thing that, Reg, come on up. The other thing is the turf war that Reg talked about that got us into such trouble with Air India. Here we're giving, anybody remember burning barns? That's why we created CSIS in the first place, to be an intelligence service, not a law enforcement service. Now they're going to let those lines be blurred and maybe take us right back to where we were before CSIS was created in the first place. Reg?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word about every time it's been raised in Parliament about, pipeline protesters and First Nations and so on, they jump in and say, oh no, we've taken care of that because we have this exemption for lawful advocacy, protest, dissent, and artistic expression. And the point has been made that, lawful protest and all the ambiguity that involves with civil disobedience and so on. But I'd like to raise something else, which is based on the research that I've done in the book that I did on the history of the security service. And there's a long history about this, which is that you go back to the Cold War, and they said, well, we're not really interested in, legitimate trade unions, but we're interested in stopping the communists who are in the trade unions. How do you spy on the communists in the trade unions without spying on the trade unions? So, in fact, they end up with tens of thousands of pages of documents based on the spying on all kinds of Canadian, just about every union in the country. And this goes on through the 1970s. In Quebec, they said, we're interested in the violent terrorists, the FLQ, but they ended up spying on the Parti Québécois, a lawful party, a legitimate political party, because they said they might be, the bad guys might be hiding inside the PQ. How do you distinguish it? The G20 protest in Toronto, they said they're these really, the black bloc anarchists. They're really scary people. Yeah, and it's true. They were violence prone. They went on a rampage on Saturday and the weekend of that protest and destroyed all kinds of property and so on. The next day, the police swooped in and arrested almost 1,000 peaceful protesters, none of whom, virtually none of them ever were actually convicted of anything. They're all let off. But how do you, so the problem is that you can use that question of violence, somebody might blow up a pipeline somewhere down the road. So you can spy upon the entire anti-pipeline protest. Yeah.
I'm seeking some clarification on what the NDP will do if C-51 passes as government. On Sunday, Tom Mulcair stated on Global that he was open to amending rather than repealing C-51.
Go ahead.
Peter Julian said that you guys would repeal it outright, and I was just wondering, will the NDP as government amend or repeal C-51?
So Global has retracted this story as being in error, but they don't highlight that.
Okay, I saw the interview, and it's the last question at the end, and he wouldn't state outright that he would repeal and that he was open to amendments.
Okay, I have seen the same interview, but I can tell you, and I talked directly with Tom about it afterwards because I started getting calls immediately, and Tom said, no, it was the context that we are committed to repealing this bill.
I really am pleased, of course. We talk about the erosion of Canadian values and so forth. I think that's very important. I think it's absolutely true. But I think we need to go much farther. If we look at the pattern of this government culminating in this bill, I think we need to talk about a creeping fascism in this country. I don't use that term lightly. I'm using the research that was done by Dr. Lawrence Britt in 2003, who examined Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, and Suharto's Indonesia, came up with 14 characteristics of a fascist regime. And I'm just going to read 7 of them for which this government qualifies eminently, and many more, but not so clearly. Powerful and continuing nationalism, identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, obsession with national security, which is what we're talking about here, and a couple more, labor power is suppressed, and obsession with crime and punishment. Now these are all features that this government manifests enormously. My question is, do you think we should be upping the ante and talk about a rising fascism in Canada?
Thank you for your question. And yeah, I think all of those points that you hit apply to our government. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of Canadians kind of during the anti-apartheid movement, and they were able to speak out about that. Under this new bill, that actually could be interpreted as supporting terrorism. Similarly, if you have strong feelings about Palestine or the Ukraine and have opinions that are different than your government, then that also could fall under these speech crimes or the threat to free speech. And so I think, yeah, in my opinion, I would agree with your statement.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.
That is a great question, and I think that's something we should be concerned about. I would like to first of all commend the NDP for getting some pushback, and the Green Party for giving pushback on this draconian bill. It's disgusting. But you also mentioned it's important to identify what is the threat. So there is copious amounts of evidence that the official story of 9/11, which was the progenitor for most of this war on terror behavior on the part of the governments, Canadian and American. And when will the NDP distinguish itself and call for a forensic investigation into what 9/11 really was?
Thanks. I mean, my first answer is that would be an American inquiry, not a Canadian inquiry, right?
Canadians
for sure,
also.
for sure.
So
but
it is a Canadian.
Yeah, fair enough.
Legal matter.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you for organizing this, and I commend the NDP and the Green Party's strong opposition to this bill. A couple of points, in some ways reiterations of issues that have been raised before, but one is that given that this bill will pass, is the NDP prepared to work in conjunction, especially with the Green Party, but also with individual Liberals, because this is a 338-seat election. There are certainly Liberals who are more principled than the leadership, and I would say the same even for the NDP. And it is absolutely essential not to allow the Conservatives to take seats, such as the Nanaimo Ladysmith seat, by virtue of splitting votes between the Greens and the NDP. And so is the NDP going to commit itself to essentially working cooperatively with other parties and individual party members so that we make sure that the Harper government is defeated in this coming election?
I guess the old adage, it takes two to tango, is important to remember. I mean, Tom Mulcair has said very clearly that he will do, as Jack has said, Jack Layton said, we need to work together, we want to work together. And I think he's been very clear on that. That was a few months ago when he said that. There's been no reply from the leader of the Liberal Party to that entreaty, so we'll have to see if they change. Secondly, I haven't yet seen any evidence that Liberal MPs, I take your point, we're going to have more members in the future with 338, but in the current Parliament, Randall and I watched as they stood up one by one by one and voted with the government on this.
I was listening to the CBC The Current this Monday, and they had a thing on this issue, and a couple of people are doing a website called the antiterrorlaw.ca. Craig Forsisi and Kent Roach.
Right.
Roach was on this Current. He said, as of last Monday, they were only halfway through this bill. And then the next two guests say, oh, they've read the bill. And of course, they support it. So I think there's something each of us can do when they hear somebody on the radio saying they've read the bill. They haven't read the bill. They haven't understood the bill. These guys are still working on it. So this is something everybody can do. Call them on it.
Very good. That's excellent. And I really agree with your reference to Kent Roach and Colin Forsisi. If you just Googled ROACH and FORCESE, you'll find their blog. They've done 5 in-depth analyses so far, and it's very, very instructive. So thank you for that.
Curious, do you think that the government will, or individuals, MPs will change their mind if these powers end up being used on them? In the US, Dianne Feinstein did a 180 when she found out the NSA was spying on her government.
Yeah, good point.
I'm just wondering if you think the same will happen, or...
Under existing law, the Government of Canada spied on Tommy Douglas for 50 years, right? Environmental groups are already being monitored. I'm not going to call them anti-petroleum groups. They're already being monitored, and we know very well that some of their activities have been disrupted by the RCMP. So the focus is not on the government. It's on the government directing either directly, in this case, and I do accuse the government of that, or indirectly, those forces toward the people they perceive as the enemies of Canada because they're the enemies of the government. And that's really very destructive of our democracy. So it's already taking place, and this expands that whole trend. And again, Laurel made reference to the RCMP very shocking memo that creates this whole new category of anti-petroleum activists and just lumps everybody together. Me, you, probably everybody in this room gets lumped into the same category as, and then the next sentence says, and violent extremists. So they're already doing this, but I take your rhetorical point if it's directed against the government, but the government's in charge here. And one of the very disturbing things under the Conservative government is we had a tradition of the independence of the RCMP and the independence of CSIS as agencies. And it's very clear that neither the current commissioner nor the current director of CSIS acts independently of this government.
Yeah, I would like to think that there could be conservative dissent from this. And now if you go back just a couple of years ago, there was a bill that was brought in, government bill on electronic surveillance, which was brought in by then Minister Vic Tays, and he renamed it the child pornography bill and said, you know, if you're either with us or you're with the child pornographers, if you oppose this. And actually all hell broke loose, and not least of which was in the conservative base itself. And people that were calling in on, you know, in Alberta talk shows and so on, saying, you know, what the hell are they doing? And, you know, what business is it of theirs to get? I think in some ways they've been trying to rush this bill through so quickly and so much in the dark because they don't want people to actually see it. And that includes their own people as well. And, you know, maybe if we can sort of hold this up long enough and bring up these points that, in fact, maybe some of their own support might weaken a little bit.
That's a really good point. Not to scare you even further, but this afternoon I was on the Ian Jessup show, and a caller called in and said, is this like the McCarthy era in the 1950s where everybody was a communist and people were worried about Reds under the bed and all of that chill, the kind of chill that Laurel talked about? And I said, you know, at one level it's worse. And the reason it's worse is because rather than the word communist, you now substitute the word terrorist. And if you're on this list, what's worse is that 16 government departments now will get all the information in a technology that did not exist in the 1950s. It's called the internet. And all of a sudden, the information about you is available across the Canadian government with no worries about privacy, and then to other agencies, CIA, etc., across the world. So it's the technology that makes it even more frightening if you think about part one, the information sharing provisions of C-51.
I'm a professor at the University of Victoria. I teach Canada, mainly outside the country. My field is the arts, history, and politics. I'm regularly invited to go and talk about Canada outside our country. As an aside, and very quickly, the Canadian government under Harper completely cut all funding to all Canadian studies centres around the world with the stroke of a pen. And the network that I've been working on for 30 years is very quickly disappearing. We are being isolated from the rest of the world by the Canadian government under Harper. My question is this. I'm actually a visitor. I'm from Saanich. Elizabeth May is my member of parliament. I'm very proud of her. Every so often she sends around on her, well, she has on her website a petition. And if I sometimes decide I want to sign this petition, I bring it up, and when I click on it, on my screen for a nanosecond comes up e-activist. And so someone, as you were saying, is keeping very close track of this. Now, for the first time in my long career, I sort of hesitate writing to members of parliament.
Chill.
And hesitate to sign Elizabeth May's petitions because it may put me on a no-fly list. And I would like to know what you, the panelists, think of this option of me being on a no-fly list if this bill were to pass, just because I have participated in what perhaps might be considered non-lawful dissent.
I was actually advising the Canadian government on airport security and air security. And when the no-fly list first came in, it was specifically, well, they didn't say that publicly, but it was to make sure that the American list didn't get applied to Canadian travelers to the U.S. And they did try to keep it fairly narrow and really said, you know, the only people they were going to keep off planes were ones that they had good intelligence that they represented a potential threat to aircraft, not just a potential threat in some general way. That has now gone with this new legislation, if it goes through, and the vast expanse, the sort of drift net definition of terrorism or threats to security that's in here. Anybody pops up, I mean, you know, it could be some clueless teenager, you know, putting out something on the internet saying, you know, jihadism is cool, and suddenly, you know, he's on the list. But it could be worse than that. It could, or somebody like yourself, as you say, but it could be worse than that. It could be that you just have the same name as that clueless teenager. And the problem is that it's the air carriers who have to enforce this. And they could actually be subject to action by the government if they fail. And so they're going to cover their butts. And that was one of the problems in the U.S. with the no-fly list. So Senator Edward Kennedy was told he couldn't fly because, you know, maybe they had an IRA suspect or something that was, you know, had that name. Who knows? Yeah, I think your fears are...
I think my concern with the bill is less about terrorism and much, much more about the establishment of a secret police, Canadian spying on Canadians.
Yep.
Hi there. I'm going to echo the sentiment of some of the former questioners, and thank you for organizing this town hall. Thank you. My question to the panel is that two of the things in particular, the changing of the term from potential to be a threat to the suspect may have the potential to act as a threat, as well as the bringing to trial or presenting evidence towards a judge without a defense from the other side, strike me as particularly unconstitutional. Is this something that we could in the future, should this bill pass in its current form, is this something that those two parts in particular we could see the Supreme Court strike down? Thank you.
I'll maybe start with that. I think you're dead on. And one of the practical things I'm wondering why the government doesn't immediately do is take those 2 or 3 obviously unconstitutional sections and do what's called a reference. Remember they did a reference on the Senate? They did a reference on whether we should have a national securities regulator. Why don't they do a reference on this bill? Not all of it maybe, but just the obviously unconstitutional ones. Terrorism in general. You know, no one thinks that's going to stand up. The way in which we I liked Reg's expression, using our police to be using our courts to be part of the law enforcement apparatus. That's totally un-Canadian in a fundamental way. And so the idea of a reference is one I've been thinking about, and suspend the provisions before we get used to using them and letting CSIS and start to use powers which are probably illegal in the first place. So I think that's a good suggestion myself. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I guess I'm PO'd at the media. We're not getting the story here. I thank Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, for informing me about a lot of things. Unfortunately, it's turning out that we're not such nice people around the world. Our behavior in other parts of the world, it's not the way we've been led to believe. And I don't think that's the way we're supposed to, we want to behave. I taught my children virtues and what sins and virtues were. I think that's important, and reading your article, my question is, even if we go ahead and have some kind of oversight thing going on here, based on what Snowden has released and how the NSA has been unable, their oversight committee has been completely in the dark, totally lied to by the head of the NSA. And so why would we believe that a secret court and a secret agency would behave any better here in Canada?
Okay. Reg?
That's a very good point. And in fact, I've been writing things about exactly that in the last little while. And unfortunately, there is a problem. There is a limit on oversight and review in the official sense. And let's say that the Conservatives have opposed it altogether, but let's say we have a parliamentary committee and on national security, and those members are security cleared. Well, that's good, because that means that they can then see what is inside the charmed circle. But they're trapped because they can't then talk about that outside to their constituents and to the public. And Edward Snowden, I think, represents something very important, and that is the rise of what I call guerrilla accountability. And that is to break through that and in fact, what he has revealed, and it's about Canada as well, not just about the U.S., is incredibly important. And you have the President of the United States saying, "Oh, we're going to do all these things." Because this has nothing to do with the fact that Mr. Snowden, who's a traitor and so on, has revealed this. But of course, they never would have done it if it hadn't been for those. So I'm saying, bring it on, bring on more guerrilla accountability.
Yes. Oh, Laura, thank you so much. Yeah.
And I didn't want to address your question, but just the first thing that you said, which was that you were mad at the media. And I think this is also something that needs to be addressed, is that a lot of us now get our news from alternative media sources. And there are some great alternative media sources out there, and this bill actually puts them at risk as well because of this threat to free speech.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks, Laura.
Just one of the things that you mentioned, which I did raise in my speech, and I'm going to differ a little with Reg on preventative detention. I think the dangerous thing about preventative detention is times of crisis. And we have a very bad history in this country in times of crisis of detaining people who did nothing wrong, were never charged with anything, and never convicted. And in my speech, I talked about Japanese Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians, and more than 1,000 people who were arrested in Quebec during the War Measures Act time, none of whom were ever charged, let alone convicted with any offense. And when you say, well, times of crisis, things happen, people lost their jobs, some people lost their houses because they'd lost their jobs. It had very serious impacts, even in the 1970s. And we go back to Ukrainian Canadians and Japanese Canadians who lost everything as a result of these illegal detentions. So if we come to a period of crisis and this lower standard for detention remains on the books, I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Thank you very much for holding this panel tonight. It's very informative, and I think through getting all this information, unfortunately I'm not exactly excited about this. I'm more fearful. Mm-hmm. And so the question is simple, but it might be difficult to answer. What can we do?
Randall? Yeah, you want to start? Laurel, do you want to start?
Parliament, so we can't stand there with you. We thank you very much for standing against it. But we know that you're on our side. So what can we do beyond that?
I'll start, and I'm going to invite others to step up. I want to say what I'll say at the end, I'll say right now. I want to thank you because you're being here, just bearing witness. Your curiosity, your concern as Canadians is really inspirational, and I'll take that back. I know Randall will take it back. We're going to continue to fight even harder now that we know the level of concern in our community. We represent you. We hear from you. We've heard, I guess there's about 2 or 3 issues since I got elected that have galvanized this community. This is one. So you have to know that that's the first thing. We'll be speaking up as strongly as we can. Write us letters, send us emails, ask questions we can use. Give us personal illustrations. Give us examples that you have been prompted by tonight's discussion to perhaps give to us, and we'll take it back and we'll throw them right back at the government because this is too important. I'm going to invite others to do so as well. Laurel?
Thank you. Great question. And I think there are a number of things that we can do. One has already been mentioned, which is write letters. Write letters to your own MP. Write letters to Justin Trudeau. Why are you supporting this bill? Write letters to Stephen Harper. Honestly, the more we get out there. Also, talk to your friends about this. We've got a lot of people in here. If everyone talks to their communities, then we can get the word out about the problematic aspects of this bill and that it actually needs to be stopped. Another thing is, I almost hesitate to encourage this because I do know the risks under this bill, participating in collective action, speaking out, but I want to encourage people to do that anyway and to take those risks, to continue to kind of fight for social justice, to continue to speak out against oppression. Social movements are an integral part of our democracy, an integral part of holding our government to account, so please continue to do that.
I'm a member of a Muslim community, and so first of all, thank you so much for organizing this. And when I see everyone here raising their voice, it helps me just feel that I'm so proud to be a Canadian.
Thank you. Thank
you. These are challenging times for all of us. Not just for Muslims, but also everyone else in the world. And so the choices we make today will impact our children and their children. And we know that is what we discussed about the Japanese and the Ukrainians. And we have a tragic past that we need to acknowledge. So we can't repeat that. So, and the Muslim community here in Victoria are active. We are trying our best to address the issues, but my question is, what is, if this bill does come into effect, what is pragmatically possible in modifying it to make it less severe as what it is in current shape? And the second is, what do you ask from the Muslim community in Victoria, and even Canada, how we can help counter terrorism?
Thank you. Those are great questions.
Well, I'm going to turn your question around a little bit. And the Muslim Lawyers Association I met with, I had extensive meetings with, and one of the things that they said is that they were going to work very hard to make sure Canadians didn't think this was just about Muslims and environmentalists. And I think that's one of the things that the Muslim community could do. But the other side, I'm going to turn around on you, is reach out to the rest of us, right? And let's work together.
I think it's really, really great that you asked the last question, and I think it really kind of brought a lot of it together, so thank you for doing that. I want to say that, maybe we need more raging grannies. I guess that's part of the solution, I don't know. I want to say just toward the end here that if you want to get the full text of this bill, make sure you give your email address to Jordan, who's waving his hand at the back. We'll send it to you along with an information package about this meeting. I just want to say a couple things in closing. I'm going to invite anybody who has a question to come on up. We'll do a little bit of one-on-one. We're going to continue to listen to you, and we're going to make sure the government gives this bill the scrutiny it deserves. You have our promise. We're going to do our very, very best. No one here doesn't recognize that terrorism is a real threat. But we reject the politics of fear. We reject the use of national security. We reject the use of national security, our national security, being used as a wedge issue in a pre-election period. It's shocking to me that we've come to this in Canada. And we reject the false choice between our values and our security. We're going to do the hard work. We're going to work with you. We think we can uphold both of those values. I want to thank very, very much our panel, Laurel, Reg, and Randall. They were wonderful resources. But I just have to say, I want to thank you most of all, because this is so inspiring to all of us that you're here. Please let us work with you. Let's see if we can defeat this, or at least make it better than it is now. Thank you so much for coming.